Hello people of the internet, this is GM Atank from Paint to Life with a special painting video with commentary. This is the Nolzur's Marvelous Miniatures Paint Night Manticore. So if you picked up one of these Manticores or you are somewhere where the Paint Night kit is not available, this is the video for you. We're going to go through some basic painting tutorial stuff that I don't usually cover in these videos. So some of it might be old hat to some of you veterans out there, but for some of you who are painting for the first time, we're going to start to cover some basic stuff. So, Chapter 1, Miniature Preparation, Mold Line Removal. Now, mold lines are caused when these figures that we like to paint are formed. And what they are, they're little seams. You can see it in the arrow there. It's a little seam where the plastic is kind of bubbled up, and they're called mold lines. If you don't remove them and paint over them like I did in this example when I was a newbie, they're visible in the finished product. And if you're okay with that for tabletop ready, that's great. But for us who are trying to advance, we want to remove those. So the first thing I did with this Manticore was went through him with that mold line remover I have and basically just gently scraped off any of those raised edges you find. Now, because these miniatures are pre-primed with a Vallejo gray, you're going to be scraping off some primer, but that's going to be okay because your paint will still stick just fine. You can use an X-Acto knife if you don't have a mold line remover per se. I also use a toothbrush once I've been scraping just to get off the little pieces of plastic and primer that are coming off, and out comes my trusty X-Acto here. For especially like, sometimes this is more than just mold lines, sometimes it's paint primer which gums up in between fingernails and digits and stuff, so I'll use the knife to cut that out. And with the toothbrush and the X-Acto knife, you're good. You've gotten all those little trimmy things off, and that is the first part of miniature preparation. Chapter 2, Gap Filling. When they put these miniatures together, they're cast in different pieces and then they're glued together. Sometimes there are hideous gaps that are visible. We can look here at this example where the tail is glued in. There's a hole there. You can't paint over that hole, folks. Paint will just sink right in there, and you'll have this visible sunken area. Here's this Nightmare Dragon I haven't painted yet. You can see the seams. So we use a product called liquid green stuff. There are other products on the market. I prefer to use this. There's also something called straight green stuff. Liquid green stuff, as you see, it goes on with a spatula, a little teeny tool that you have. You can wipe your finger on it, add a little bit of water to a junker brush. We'll get to brushes soon. And you can spread it all out. Make sure you don't wipe it away too much. You want it to settle in the cracks. This Manticore had quite a few seams. And again, if it's just for tabletop, and I'm not even the best at filling them, I just like to spend a little bit of time filling those extra cracks. So once you paint over top of that, you won't see them nearly as much. This stuff shrinks when it dries. See under his mane there, I had some, under his tail, etc., and under his wings. So that's what the green is, you'll see. Part 3, paint brushes. Now when you start painting, you're going to use all kinds of different brushes, and you don't need to spend a lot of money at all. You can get some from the dollar store, but you know, your mileage will vary. So the first brush, there's my selection of brushes. Again, there's no like $1 million brushes in there. This is a teeny craft brush I use to spread glue around. It's a dollar store brush. These are junker brushes, old ones I've marked with tape, so I use them for things like liquid green stuff and metallic paints. That's just a regular old craft brush for putting a lot of paint on bases and stuff. That's a Citadel dry brush. Dry brushing is important, we'll get to, so you should get yourself a dry brush. A shader brush is just a brush that says shade on it, and I use just for shades and contrast paints exclusively, but you could use any brush for shade and contrast paints. And finally, just some various brushes. I bought all these from my friendly local gaming store. Each brush was anywhere from $3 to $7 each, and varying sizes for the things you're going to want to do. If you get into the hobby more, you can spend some more money, but for now, that'll be great. Now, must have a wet palette. You can just put your paints on a tile or on a piece of plastic, but they will dry out on you. Take a look at this palette. That's my homemade wet palette. We're going to make one for $5. All the paints stay nice and moist, so you're going to need some parchment paper. It can't be wax paper, it needs to be parchment paper, you see there. Some paper towels, and any kind of lid or Tupperware lid like I have in this example here. Now they sell wet palettes, but I think this one is real great and easy to make. So the first thing we're going to do is cut out some of that parchment paper into little squares or rectangles like that. Take a paper towel, one of these Bounties, nice, it folds perfectly in half, and that's the perfect size for my Tupperware container, but your mileage will vary. And then I rip it in half to keep it about the size of the piece that I'm going into. That's what's going to absorb all the water and keep it moist. so kind of fit it inside the lid, and I replace this whenever I need to if it gets paint on it, or again, it's pretty much free. I mean, a roll of paper towel is $2. Use the paintbrush just to kind of fit it in here. And by no means did I discover this. I mean, there's lots of tutorials on the online about how to make wet palettes, but this is just the Paint to Life version. So once I've got it kind of squared in there, I'm going to take my water from one of my mason jars that I paint with. And it doesn't have to be perfect, folks. This just needs to stay flat, and that's why I try and keep it up on the edges so it prevents air bubbles. And I just pour water in there, quite a bit, lots, way more than I need. That'll run out, and I'll use my brush to further sink down the corners to make sure that Bounty paper towel is flat on the plastic. And that looks good. There's no air bubbles. And now I will drain the excess water back into my mason jar without worrying about the paper towel falling off because it's stuck to the plastic. There it goes. You want to keep it pretty saturated. This is going to keep your paints moist and fresh for hours upon hours. When I do a big project, I put all my paints out in advance and I have them the whole time. So now I take that little rectangle of parchment paper and I press it down flat on the paper towel. I run my fingers along it to push it down so it sticks, and my fingers will get a little wet, and that's okay. Some of the water comes up on top, and it helps you thin your paints as well because it'll naturally have the moisture. Now, for paints that are like contrast paints that are already really runny, I don't put them on the wet palette. I put them in dry, you know, some kind of flat little bowl or something. But for all my layer and base paints, I'll put it in here. So I've got a black example here. It's from Green Stuff World, just their Midnight Black. A couple drops on there, and I'm going to put another kind on there too. So that gives you an example of how that wet palette looks, and that's how I work. And I just use that. And I could make a bigger square of parchment, but I find that I don't usually use that many, and I don't need much more room, but you know, it's up to you how you want to develop that for yourself. Now you'll notice after 4 hours sitting on that palette, those paints are still super wet, and you can even get more mileage if you put them in the fridge. So chapter 5, when you're painting, you're going to have brush care. Even if you have cheap brushes, expensive brushes, you want to take care of them. And the best product on the market that I find to do that is this the Masters brush cleaner. You can get that at Michael's for 14 bucks. I've had that jar for 2 years. It's never let me down. You can use a coupon at Michael's. So you can see here I've painted this wing in preparation for what we're going to do later in the video. I'm just going to let it dry. Now my brush is dirty and it has black paint in it. So how exactly do I use this Masters? Well, I take the brush, I rinse it in my water, in my mason cup. Okay, that's good, nice and rinsed out. But then I take my Masters, and while the brush is wet, I just rub it in there. Come on, let's go, Mike. Rub it in there. It's coming. So yeah, just left, right, a little bit of extra water. Just swirl it around in there. It picks up this stuff. It conditions and cleans the brush. It's like a goopy kind of like cream on it or butter. You just rinse it off, repeat, rinse it off, repeat. And then the last thing I do when I've done it a few times, see again, just push, 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 and all that little pigment's going to come out of there. It'll make a mess of that. I cheated and cleaned it for the video so it looked pretty. And it's normally full of pigment. So now that I've scraped all that butter off of there, before I put this brush away, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe it one more time in the Masters, just left and right, left, right, and then I'll use my fingers. See how I kind of roll it there? And then I use my fingers. Okay, here we go. And I gotta just shape. I reshape the point of my brush, give a little twist, and leave it. Don't rinse it again. Just go put that away like that. And then when you get to it next time, it'll be a little dry, but it'll be in good shape and it's conditioned, and that's Masters. That's how you take care of your brushes. And if you have a professional expensive brush, don't follow my instructions because I've never used one. Chapter 6, Basic Painting. So now we're getting into the painting video. Here I go with our Manticore from episode 24 of Paint to Life. So I'm starting with Acadian Flesh Tone. You can see the green stuff is all dry, and that's what that is, as we've seen earlier. I'm going to apply Acadian Flesh Tone. I can't recall if it's a base or a layer paint, but either way, you can use them. It doesn't matter if it's base or layer. Conceptually, you want to put a base down first and then layer up on the base, but I like, depending on the color that I want to use, sometimes I use that as my base coat. So Acadian Flesh Tone, because the Manticore has like the man-like face, And I guess he's a Caucasian Manticore. Alright, next color, you can see I've switched on my palette to Jokero Orange. I followed the, I'm going to put up right here the picture for the inspiration for my Manticore. It came from the Monsters Manual. As you can see, it's a lot of browns. It looks like a real lion, and fleshy flesh tones. And that's where my palette choice came from. And it's kind of boring to paint that way, but when you're trying to paint them to the world of the Dungeons and Dragons, that's what you kind of have to do. I mean, you don't have to, but you know what I mean. So up he comes, up his legs pretty much everywhere. He's going to be a lion. He's going to be this Jokero Orange. This is, I think it's a base coat. It doesn't matter, like I said before. Just thin your paints, people. When you put them on that wet palette, add a little dab of water to them. It's better that they go on liquidy and light, and then you can come back and add more layers of the same, whether it's a base or a layer paint, than glopping it on so it dries thick and snot and clogs all the details of the mini, should said details exist. And I fully intend to do the palms of his hands a different color, but again, since this is the base coat, I paint it all orange, and I'm going to hit it later with the lighter flesh tone underneath and build up on top of this orange. Because some Citadel paints in particular, some of them are quite transparent, so the orange underneath will kind of come through and make a cool effect. I'm also going to be doing some there are, more advanced painting techniques I'm not covering in this video, like wet blending and when you put two colors of paint on your brush at once. I can't remember what that's called, but this is just for basic. I expect you guys, some of you have maybe never painted before, and that's why you're following these instructions. There's a lot of great tutorials out there on the internet. I learn from them and trial and error. This is just for those of you who have found my channel, and maybe you're in Canada or international and you don't have access to this paint kit and you're going to kind of just wing it by doing it on your own. Well, hopefully this will help you get through it. So again, I'm putting the Jokero Orange all over his those bony, spinal, like kind of fingers that go up between his wings, and up his tail, and on his backside, etc., etc. Alright, moving on to a Kislev flesh. It's a layer paint, and you see I'm painting over the Jokero Orange, underneath his arms, on his palms, anywhere I wanted it to be lighter. And Kislev is also lighter than the Cadian flesh I put on his face. So I started with a darker flesh tone, and I'm going to put a lighter flesh on top of it as an accent color. So you can also see I'm putting it on the tops of his paws, his underbelly, up on his groinal area, in different spots of the face, the raised kind of areas. And if you apply it while the paint underneath is still wet, you get what's called a wet blend. And if you do it right, and there's no way for me to explain how, not in this video anyways, you will get a nice blended effect. If you do it too much, if you put too much wet on wet, you'll blend the two colors and you'll have a combination of Kislev flesh and Jokero Orange. But these paints dry really quickly, so unless you put something in it to make the dry slower, if you put the Jokero Orange on, within 10 minutes you could be painting on a dry bed. So as you can see, I also put this in the wing webbing for now, with fully intention to play with it a little more, but this is the undercoat to get rid of that gray, so when it shines through as a fleshy tone as opposed to a gray underneath. See, I messed up, I hit the side, so I fixed it. If you touch paint on something that's dry and it's not supposed to be, you can clean your brush off with water, or use a different brush that's just straight water and wash it off basically like a brush with water, and absorb and soak up all that extra paint, and before it has a chance to dry and leave a little crust. I'm thinking about all the mini painters out there that I've watched over the years and how hardcore they are. They're like university painters, and you're sitting with me, I'm like a high school painter. Hey guys, I never said I was the shit. I'm just here to help, and if we were buddies, we'd be drinking a beer and doing it together, but because of COVID and the fact that you probably live on the other side of the world, we'll just have to do it this way. So we're about to switch paints here, just finishing the underside of the wing. One other thing, you can have holders for these things. People put them on corks with sticky tack or holders. I use my fingers unless I need a holder, which I will later in this video. Okay. Our next step here, Cachatan flesh. It's a brownish kind of color, and I'm putting on his mane. And actually, I think that might be a mistake. That doesn't look like Catch Tan Flesh to me. That looks like Doom Bull Brown. I might have made a mistake with the color code there. But guys, remember, there's no right or wrong answer. You can make his mane gray. He could have gray hair. He could have yellow hair like a lion. He could have pink hair. It's up to you. I'm following, as I showed you, that source picture from earlier, hence why I'm following kind of true to that. But it's, you know, your choice. And I put those tool tips up there so you can see what colors I use. But sometimes if I use a lot, or if I paint them over a couple days before I do this part of the video, I might mistakenly put the wrong paint down. So he has some spines dug into his hair as well. I just painted over them now with this because I'm planning to do some other techniques to the mane, and I'll hit those spines later. Sometimes I'm getting better at holding the camera, and I've zoomed in a bit for this paint job, but sometimes, unfortunately, without having a monitor to see what I'm painting while I'm painting, sometimes I obstruct my own vision with wings and arms, etc. like that. You can also see that green stuff is showing through in some of the areas because it'll need another coat. Okay, we're going to go to another color now, Ungor Flesh. I'm putting some of this on the wing at the bottom of the wing, not all the way. I want it to be Kislev and Ungor. So you can see I'm kind of just layering in the spots. And like I said, the liquid green stuff is such like a forest green that if you paint a light color over it, you might need a couple coats to cover it without, you don't go thick, just go multiple coats, right? Thin your paints so that they're going nice and liquidy smooth. See them go on those spikes? Super nice. And this is just the Ungor. And I'm planning on painting those another color now. I was just using it to cover the green stuff right now. And just to clean it all up as I go in layers upon layers. And, you know, usually when I'm painting, some kind of eureka happens. And actually, we'll talk about that when the time comes later. Okay, now we're on to the squig orange. So I wanted an orange mane, but notice I'm not painting over that Doom Bull brown completely. I'm gently applying the brush so that it doesn't go into the cracks. I want the Doom Bull brown to be underneath it, but I want the squig orange to be on top of it. So when you look at that, you'll see the brown underneath and the orange on top. It gives it kind of a reddy effect. The lighting isn't great, but it looks really cool in real life. So don't fill in all those cracks. Don't put so much paint on your brush that's going to drip down in there and cover all that brown. You want a two-tone effect here. And now I'm starting with my warp block bronze for my quills. It's an interesting choice, but I wanted to use a bit of a metallic for a little bit of excitement in the color so it wasn't flat. I didn't want to do steel spines. Some of the book spines, they look like creamy, but there's already so much cream and flesh on this thing that I wanted to put something, it's not like by any means a contrast, but the fact that warp block bronze is a cool metallic paint and the brown kind of goes with the hair, I thought would look good, and that's what I did. So all of his spines, including the one in his hair and in his body, are the warp block bronze. Okay, next part of our painting practice is chapter 7, dry brushing. So you've seen me write in our videos before dry brushing, and now I'm going to explain to you what it is and you'll see it. Dry brushing uses special paints from Citadel called dry paints. That's the effect you can get. That was dry brushed on top of black. And if we look at Zariel here, dry brushed on top of black, both an orange and a red. So they have their own line of dry brushes. They have their own line of dry brush paints, and that's what they look like. Thick, clunky. This Necron compound, it looks actually flaky, and that's the way it's supposed to look. So as we see inside this Necron compound, we take out these little chunks of paste or dried paint chunks and go ahead and wipe them on a paper towel, mix it around, fill the filaments of the brush with that Necron compound. And then we're going to wipe the brush again and again and again until most of that paint is off. Wipe it on your finger to test, sure, but there's still some left. And then when we gently drag it across the top of something like this wing I'm testing it on, you can see that paint is transferring. So if you want to give something a metallic sheen without painting it silver, you dry brush it with something like Necron compound. See? It doesn't get in the sunken areas. Now next I'm using this blue, same idea. an important thing is you can dry brush with any paint. You don't need a dry brush paint from Citadel to do this. It's just kind of easier. See, load my paintbrush up, dry, wipe, wipe, wipe until almost there's nothing coming off it, but there's still lots on there. So when I drag it across this wing, again, look at all that blue. Where'd that even come from? It lets the black shine through underneath. And now I will show you what that looked like when it was dry with this shot right here. And there it is. That's how dry brushing works. And it's important to remember you can dry brush with any paint, not just dry brush paints, but they just kind of are a little bit easier to work with because they come out of the box already pre-dried out. You don't have to waste a lot on the paper towel drying it manually. So now that you've seen some dry brushing, you can see my Eldar Flash dry brush example on the main, on top of the Squig Orange and the Doombull Brown. This is just bringing in some lighter color to try and give that main a look of 3 dimensions about it, on top of all the Warp Block bronze, everything. Just goes on top, it adds lighter, and I'll put some paint on it later. Next, I'm using rat skin flesh. Oh, and that's it for the dry brushing, by the way. In there wasn't much. So rat skin flesh is kind of an orangey color, but it's not quite the same. It was on my palette from the wet palette earlier. And see how I'm kind of arcing and I'm using my finger to just smudge it on top of that light area. You can do this sort of thing. I don't know what it's called. It's called finger painting, I suppose. Leave a little bit of an arc, a little bit of a finger rub. Maybe you could achieve that with a brush. I like to use my finger. It makes like a little blend. And I'm going to do that on the other side as well. But I'm purposely arcing the brush, and I put it on his, on the back sides too. I'm purposely arcing the brush to leave that lighter area underneath, and I'll touch on that with some brown later. And that just gives some gradient effect. Again, go down, leave a bit, brush it with your finger, leave a bit, leave those McArches. McDonald's. Yeah, you don't need McDonald's. I know. So there we go. And again, the more paint you have, the more options you have. But guys, you could have 3 paints. This painting kit comes with, I think, 8. You could have however many paints. You have black and white. You can mix to your heart's content, make all kinds of fun colors. Just try and keep track of how you made it in case you need some more later, and you can recreate it. Okay, and now we're on to the Deathclaw Brown. Now, Deathclaw Brown's going on top of the arms and the shoulders and under the wings, only because he was pretty fleshy, and this brown brings it more into animal. And I go up the wing armature there, but not all the way, just halfway, and let it trail off while it's still wet. I feel like this brown is making it look more like a lion instead of a human on all fours. And I was saying something earlier about trying new things, and sometimes you just have to do that. Sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're just left with a happy accident, as was the case with this. I think it's the very next paint, because this looks pretty good so far to me. Doombull Brown, again, the one from the main. I tried to do some like lines, like tiger, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna put more. I brushed it all together, and I'm like, oh, okay, we're gonna do that, are we? So all these lines I was trying to make, I didn't want to make tiger stripes, but I'm putting it on wet, so that other brown is still wet, and I'm putting this dark brown on top of it, and it's mixing, and the next thing I know, I have a swampy mess. Oh, and by the way, this plastic is super malleable, so I'm just holding that wing up and folding it over. A little bit of those stripes, ooh, a little heavy, and I'm like, oh no, I just ruined it. I was liking it, and now I've ruined it. I'm literally Bob Ross when he's got a great landscape and then he starts drawing trees everywhere and ruins it, but I didn't think so ultimately, because when we went to the contrast stage, we're going to put something on there and it's going to show through underneath this brown and it's going to look great, in my opinion. So back to the Kachatan Flesh, which is the color that I used on him somewhere else earlier on. And I don't want to go too up. I don't want to put so much on here that it obscures that nice gradient I got with my finger. But I do want to put it on so that the tips of his wings are this kind of brown. And then there's the gradient and then the ratkin flesh. Okay, so there are the wings. Looking good. Chapter 8, Contrast Paints. Contrast paints were designed to act like a base paint and a shade in the same thing. We're going to learn about shades next. So here's an example of what contrast paint is all about. Citadel has a line of them. I have that many. I like them because they're new colors. If you see the bottom of your contrast paint has any type of white underneath it, like looks like milk or powder, shake, shake, shake. You have to shake them until the bottom looks like that, nice and green, or whatever color it's supposed to be. So this example wing that I have here from my old Diablo that I didn't use wings for, I'm going to use my shade brush in this contrast paint, and it's very runny. I just spilled it on my finger. Dang. Dry it off with the napkin. Whoopsie, could have cut this. Good job. So now I'm going to apply this runny paint, again, not on my wet palette, just on this, and now we're just going to paint it on to and that color is I don't know what it is, doesn't matter, it's just for showing you whatever color underneath is going to come through. The contrast paint kind of goes on transparent, and the darker pigments sink into the recessed areas. So I'm putting the green on this kind of whatever it is, just so you can see, and I'll have a picture here at the end of what it looks like when it dried, and you can see it's transparent. And that's what a contrast paint does. It sinks into the recesses and kind of shades as you go. So I'm using a dark oath flesh contrast paint on his face, which I've already painted with, as you know, a base and a layer. And all this dark oath is going to do, and I pull it off of his face, don't want it too much, I push it off onto that dry brushed mane, because it was looking pretty chalky. Once this hits it, it kind of stops being chalky, right? All that lightness gets soaked up, and it blends together nicely. So again, dark oath flesh on the top of the wings. They're transparent. It doesn't lose the gradient. It doesn't lose the brown at the tip. In fact, the paint itself is see-through, and since dark oath flesh has kind of got like a reddy kind of fleshy color anyways, you just make sure you don't leave too much. All those dark puddles that you leave behind will settle in recesses and look like awful. So you have to, don't play with it too much, just apply it and check it out. I'm doing the same thing with Agaro's Dunes underneath. Now I apologize for the camera angle. This is my example of holding it with a clip or whatever. Agaro's Dunes is more of a yellow instead of the dark earth flesh, which is more of a red. So underneath his wings are going to be lighter. They're going to take on a more yellow tone than the tops, which are going to have a more red tone. And then furthermore, when I add some purple to it later, which is off camera, but you'll see in the finished product. So I'm painting the base with Tolaran sand. This is not quite basing yet. I'm just finishing off the model, and you know, I'm just gonna put a layer because I want to do kind of a sandy scene. So I'm putting some Tolaran sand down so that when it dries, the sand doesn't, you know, if you paint your base black and put sand on it, you're gonna have particles of sand exposing the black behind it. So Tolaran sand goes down first, and all around the edge. I haven't pasted him onto his base yet, but eventually that happens. Also, the contrast paints that we talked about earlier, you don't need to use them. You can just use shades, which we're going to get to. So, Ayandan yellow, this is different contrast paint, and this was the secret sauce on the model. When I put this yellow on top of all that brown, remember the different color browns we had on the side? Instantly, he looks like a lion. Look at that. I know the wing's in the way, dang it, but all that brown and the flesh tone and on his back and the rat skin, I just put it on his sides, his tail, his ass. Look at how yellow that looks now. It's great. Pallid witch flesh is the teeth. I don't like white teeth. I don't know many teeth that are white. He's got rows of them, so I'm going to go deep into his mouth to cover those rows. And we're going to hit it with the shade as well, which is the next chapter of our little painting tutorial. But for now, I'm just going in there with my tiny brush to hit all those teeth that are underneath with this pallid witch flesh. But yeah, back to that yellow. Dang, looks super hot now. Looks like a lion's body. He looks like he's got a mouthful of toothpaste. That's okay. We're going to bring out the next tool in our toolbox soon, the shade. And then we'll bring out all those little details, kind of like a contrast paint. So I white the eyes, and then I flash gits, yellow the eyes. Just steady hand. Put a little bit of paint on your brush. It'll naturally form a little circle, and then when you touch it, it'll drop on. Kislev flesh. Now he had these cool veins on his wings. You can see the wings are more red on top. Gently touching those veins with this fleshy color. And Magos purple not shown. It's another contrast paint, which those veins are going to look very varicosy. and it looks very red / orange on the top, yellow on the bottom. So by splashing some of that purple contrast paint on top, just a little bit, not too much, it brings more of the red out of the top of the wings and looks more fleshy. But you can see how that contrast paint has dried in the crevices. The higher pigmentation is really sunken in and made it look alive. And then these little worms I'm putting on top, because they're really bright, so the contrast paint will also nullify them a bit. A Batten Black on a toothpick. I don't use a toothpick very often. I tried this time, it worked for me. So, Chapter 9, Shade Paints. Probably the most common paints that I use in Paint to Life is Nuln Oil, as most other people, and Agrax Earthshade. Great shaders to have. Here's my collection of shades. So what we're going to do here is, and you can see in my little example video here, so this other section of the wing that hasn't been painted yet, there's all kinds of little details on there, right? And you just see one solid color. Well, I'm sure you've heard of the magic that is Nuln Oil. So open it up we will. We'll use our little shade brush, and we're going to apply it on there, you know, as much as we want. Know that the pigment's going to settle into the recesses, and if you have too much of a big ball of snot, it's just going to be a big black circle. So you don't want too much, but you don't want too little either, because you want it to fill those little holes. So as you can see, I'm gently brushing it on to that Bugman's Glow. That's the color I used for that wing. See the contrast paint beside it, the green one on the left, and the Bugman's Glow now with Nuln Oil. All those little details are all showing up now in like a nice dark black. And that's what you do for shading. That's the whole point of a shade. And if you're going to buy any, buy a Nuln Oil and an Agrax Earthshade, the best two shades to start with. So back to our Manticore. Inside his mouth, he's just this big wall of white. Well, when I put some Nuln Oil in there, it sinks between all the little crevices of all the teeth that they cut out and modeled in there and gives him definition. Final chapter, basing. The most fun part and least expensive part, or most expensive, depending on how you want to go. Basing is often overlooked by many YouTubers. Here's my collection of basing materials. And they don't have to cost anything. Look I have barks, I have sticks, I have a cotton ball, I have some stones from the driveway. I have mosses. Those were like $1 a bag at the Michael's. I've got a bag of sand from the beach. I've got some Army Painter snow basing. All these different kinds of tufts. They were like $7 each. I collected them all. I have an old computer. I stripped wire out of cord, and I have all these little transistors on that computer motherboard, so that if I'm ever going to do like a technical or like a sci-fi base, I'll have all those pieces. And additionally, you can buy little resin skulls. Like I got these from Green Stuff World for $7 each. You know, I use this Citadel Wraith Bone to prime them all with Wraith Bone, and then use the contrast paint called Skeleton Bone. And now I have all these little skulls. Anytime I need to use one, I just snip them off and glue them on my base, as we're about to see. So we take some white glue, just some good old glue all white glue. Use that glue brush I showed you earlier, which is just for glue. Spread it around nice and thin. And then I'm literally going to pour sand on it. And then I can put a concoction of glue and water, or sometimes alcohol, on top of the sand so that it hardens like a rock when it's done. But for now, desert sand. That's right. Prove it's not. Pour it on there. Let it dry. Later I'm going to put some of this little cork. It's ground up cork that I have. Again, your imagination is your friend when you're basing. Look everywhere. You can find things all over the place that you've never even considered. Battlefield rocks go on there, and some of that ground up cork goes on there. It gives all kinds of different textures and grades. And then I coat it with some more of that APB later with some diluted glue just to seal it all in. And as you can see in the finished picture here, I have put a tuft underneath this Manticore. I used the red one with flowers just for a little contrasting color. There are some skulls that I've glued on there, like the ones we were talking about earlier. I put 3 on there. You can see the dry brushing on his mane kind of makes it look a little bit lighter than if it was just all brown. Could have dry brushed his quills, but I wanted to keep them kind of dark. You can see the top of the wing has that Magos purple on there. See the stripes and the browns, all of them on top with that yellow on top of his side. It gives him a real lion-like coloring. And the basing with the different pebbles of rocks and ground up cork. And finally, like someone in the comments said, where's his butthole? Well, the struggle was real. I chose not to paint a butthole on there, but you feel free to do that if you want, or make little nards out of green stuff and stick them on there. Anyways, I hope this helped you. That was my Manticore. Wasn't the best paint job I ever did, but I had a lot of fun. And you know what? It at very least is tabletop worthy. And yours will be too, because it will look better than the gray, boring ass thing that it looked like before you touched it with a paintbrush. So I hoped this helped you. Please let me know in the comments below if it did. This is the longest working paint video I have ever done. I put a lot of extra time in it for you guys, so even if it helps just one person, that will make it worth my while. So thank you very much again for watching. I'm GM Atank. Wash your hands, people. We'll see you next time.